I want to introduce to you Professor Sarah Joseph, who's joining us on the panel here this morning. Sarah's a Professor of Human Rights Law now at Griffith University, but of course she was a Professor of Law at Monash University and our former Director at the Castan Centre for 15 years. Her publications focus on human rights internationally and in Australia, and with particular expertise on the ICCPR, business and human rights, trade and human rights, and a side hustle on sport and human rights, which we might get the opportunity to come into. No, it's not. That's the main one, is it? Sport. But Hugh, you traversed a huge range for us, and it was great to sort of have that come together in that way. And you raised this issue of the Federal Human Rights Act, which we have sitting on the agenda, but somewhat on the back burner. And I wondered if you had reflections off speech, sort of, on the opportunities, the political opportunity that we're at the moment. And Sarah, then your reflections also on the kind of dimensions of going forward from here.
Yeah, when I started in the job, I reached out to people like Chris Sidoti to understand more of that history. And when the Australian Human Rights Commission was set up in 1986, we were meant to be set up to have a Human Rights Act that we were the national promoter for and regulator for. And there was a bill that went through the House but never made it through the Senate. So this is something that over time different Attorneys General have attempted to get and have failed. And you can go to the Rudd government in 2009. There was a massive national consultation led by Father Frank Brennan, an avowed fence sitter on whether or not we should have a Human Rights Act, asking people around the country what they thought about how to better protect human rights. And one of the things they recommended was a Human Rights Act, and the Rudd government didn't implement it. And now we've got the Parliamentary Joint Committee recommending it. And so why hasn't it happened? I think partly in 2009, that's our fault. When I look at the way we were talking about human rights, it was typically people like me, human rights lawyers, talking about human rights. We need less lawyers talking about human rights and more people who are affected by human rights. I say that self-consciously in a academic conference full of law students and human rights practitioners, but the messages around human rights and the need for protection has to be coming from the communities that are affected by those human rights breaches. Some of the strongest opponents to a Human Rights Act back then were the media, and that has changed. So why has that changed? Why has there been CEOs of News Limited and Nine speaking in favour of a Human Rights Act? Because they have, a lot of it's about self-interest, and the Federal Police raids on the ABC and the home of Annika Smethurst helped to demonstrate for them the lack of protection of press freedom and freedom of expression. And people like Bod Carr, who was a very, very strong opponent of a Human Rights Act in 2009, has more recently come out and said he's convinced of the need for it, particularly because of national security overreach. One of the other strongest opponents was the Catholic Church. And there was a real sense of irony when I saw George Pell invoking the right to freedom of religion in about 2016 when the Royal Commission into Institutional Child Sex Abuse was arguing for mandating priests to break the confession to mandatorily report child sex abuse. So I think the landscape has changed. The people who were opposed to human rights have a greater understanding of the need for them. We saw that in COVID as well, and the time is now, and I'll be in Parliament on Monday, Tuesday next week, talking to parliamentarians about the importance of this reform.
And Sarah, your Sarah, your reflections on what Hugh said in the keynote, but also this issue specifically?
Is this on?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so you were asking about opportunities with the re-election of the Albanese government. Well, there's much more opportunities than if the opposition had been elected, because at least it's part of the ALP platform. Hugh, towards the end of his talk, mentioned I think a big opportunity was missed at the end of COVID, because that was a period of time when human rights affected everybody, and so everybody realised that human rights was relevant to them. Because unfortunately, I think part of the discussion in this country has been people thinking that, you know, human rights is not relevant to me, it's relevant to certain minorities. You know, there's always the old bugbears of it's very relevant to criminals and things like that. Whereas in COVID, everybody was affected, certainly in different ways, but everyone, you know, could recognise the relevance of human rights. Moving to the current government, they are never going to have the political capital that they have now. I don't think they can have a better majority than what they've got now, and it's almost mathematically impossible for them to lose the next election. So if they want to do it, they can, because I don't know if it's fair, but I do perceive that at least in the first term, this was a government that was quite cowed at times with regard to certain, you know, initiatives. A classic was, you know, they refused to push forward with the amendments to religious exemptions to the discrimination bill for reasons which were, well, which seemed to be, well, because the opposition won't agree with it. And it's like, well, hang on, you're the government. So one would hope that that sort of timidity won't proceed. I'm probably less, like when, I was a little surprised to hear Hugh just say that the media is more in favour of human rights. I think they might be in favour of select human rights, including their own human rights. And look, probably, actually, I'd probably even concede that the media is generally either neutral or positive, except for News Limited. I think if there was another push, or hopefully when there is another push, they will come out against it. And again, going back to timidity, the government should resist that. The last election just showed us that no one cares what News Limited think. They don't. So move forward. People especially don't care what Sky News says. And look, the final thing, I suppose, is that it will need a champion. I mean, this is getting a little bit political, but it will need a champion within the government. And I did perceive, possibly because I actually know him better, I did perceive that Mark Dreyfus was prepared to be that champion. I just don't know enough about the new Attorney General. I do know that Michelle Rowland was on the Human Rights Committee, the Parliamentary Human Rights Committee, fairly early on in its life, 2013 to 2015. But it's going to need a champion within the Cabinet. I mean, we've got Josh Burns out. I think he's outside the Cabinet. But look, there are opportunities. It doesn't seem to be a high priority because they haven't sort of mentioned it, so we have to push. And as Hugh has said, make sure it's not just lawyers and academics, but that it's a very broad base.
Yeah, it turns out no one actually wants to hear from us, but, you know, who knew? Hugh mentioned the charters and human rights acts in the states and territories, and we see that as quite an important sort of push into the space. Sarah, you've done some work on sort of public reaction to the Queensland Charter and people's perception of rights in Queensland. Can you just bring some of those points out a bit so we can, that might help us understand what would be the moving parts to consider for a federal argument?
Yeah, so I'm happy to speak as the local Queenslander. So look, just, you know, how is the Charter going in Queensland? I might start with that. And look, as in Victoria, there's lots of really important quiet wins that we just don't really hear about, okay, that come from the cases, that come from what, you know, what might be happening inside the public service when it's, you know, doing things or even considering legislation, and in the Human Rights Commission's complaints function, which is really important. That is one area where, I think there's actually several areas, I won't go into them because they're a little bit technical, but I think there are a number of areas where the Queensland Human Rights Act is sort of better or an improvement upon the Victorian one, and that's not surprising because it's 10 years later. So it's, but one very big one is that there is a complaints process and a remedy process within the Commission itself, which I gather is quite effective. Look, how's it going with the government? The new Crisafulli LNP government in Queensland, it is the LNP, Liberal Nationals are together. That's not probably going so well. The very first thing it did was to abolish the Truth and Treaty Commission and Truth and Treaty process, which had only just got off the ground. And I gather they did so without even, you know, letting the head of that commission know. So that's, you know, extremely extremely rude and extremely disdainful of that whole process. Its signature policy, and I'm not kidding, this signature policy is advertised on TV ads, is the adult time for adult crime policy for kids who commit crimes. They overrode the Human Rights Act in order to do that. They also, which was a bit strange given they overrode, they did produce, I was talking with Hugh about this, they did produce a statement of compatibility, which was a great statement of incompatibility. You know, it actually admitted straight out, yep, this does not accord with human rights. Really interestingly, it's not even proportionate. It doesn't even actually keep us safer. It was hard to kind of respond apart from to go, well, yes. So, but this is the policy that is their signature policy that they're advertising on TV. Having said that, to be fair, the previous Labor government had also overrode the policy in regards to youth justice as well. There was also a review of the Human Rights Act. It was conducted by my excellent colleague, Professor Susan Harris-Rimmer, which had 70 well thought out recommendations, and the government just dismissed all of them without any reasoning. So that's at the very least I think an exhibition of bad faith. They've also halted a process of consolidating anti-discrimination laws because they want to seek to have more consultation, and yet there's already been years of consultation. So, that doesn't sound so great.
Is it fun in Queensland?
Yeah, no, as I said, there's, well, look, it's their first, Sue Harris-Rimmer, who I just mentioned, and myself, we did some survey work of what do Queenslanders think of human rights. And it was look, at a broad general level, they're very much in favour of human rights, and they're in favour of having a Human Rights Act, and they're positive about the, look, in the first survey, a lot of them hadn't heard of it. Many more had heard of it by 2023. We did them in 21 and 23. And they were very positive about having one, and for all those people, for all those arguments about parliamentary sovereignty, they are very happy to take the government to court to enforce their human rights. I guess, look, there's many things I could say about it, and, I won't unless they come
Read the
up.
article.
Sorry?
Read the article.
Well, yeah, you can read the article, but I suppose a couple of things is we asked them which groups are you most concerned about when it comes to human rights, as in which groups' human rights are the most important. And overwhelmingly both times it was children. And we also asked particularly about children in care, I guess foster care or other types of care outside, the family. And they were rated very, very highly. Part of that was because of a horrible case in Queensland, I think back in 2018, 2019, involving foster care. But at the same time, there was very little care for youth justice or, the rights of people perceived to be criminals. And so it sort of showed that, look, you care very much about, these kids in a very disadvantaged situation without realising that in some, certainly doesn't happen to every kid, but is often the pathway and, to, issues of youth justice. And so there was a bit of a disconnect there. There were some really interesting differences between demographic groups, and one thing which is important is that I think some of the biggest and most interesting were according to wealth and levels of education. Okay, so those classic indicators of class, or what we used to call class, rather than sort of identity groups. Certainly there were differences between identity groups, but much bigger according to wealth and education. So that was interesting, and as you could expect, people with less education and less wealth were much less happy with the existing state of human rights. The final thing I could say, and look, this might come up in one of your later questions, was we asked them, we didn't ask them what's your favourite human right, we asked them what's the most important human right, and the one that came up the most was freedom of speech and or just freedom full stop. And so, and that got even stronger in 23. Now that might reflect things that happened in COVID. It might reflect Clive Palmer, but frankly in 2023 no one cared a lot about what Clive Palmer had to say, though he had freedom on a lot of ads. But that's interesting, and that's an interesting, I suppose, insight into the sorts of things people think are human rights. Housing, as you could expect, was bigger in 23 than 21, but freedom was huge. So that's an interesting, comment.
There's a lot, yeah, sure.
We were talking before just about that finding around the interest in child protection and the desire to look after kids who are in care. And the irony, obviously, is that the vast majority of kids who get into the criminal justice system, there's a very close connection between child protection as a pathway into the criminal justice system. And so we need to do a better job as advocates to be explaining to the Australian public who are these children that you're asking to do adult time and that you're treating as adults. Well, they're the kids who society has failed, who need protection. And I remember going to Victoria Police Academy and seeing some of their training, and they did a fantastic thing where they de-identified a offender in police terms profile from when they were a child. And the police interactions were victim, 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 offender, victim, victim, offender, offender, victim, offender, offender, victim, offender, offender. And it just taught police that there was this, you need to have a nuanced understanding of who it is that we're locking up when they're children and prosecuting, and what we need to do as a society to actually help kids who are in trouble to get on the right path.
Thanks. I'm going to change direction a little bit. It seems like we're living in really high conflict times. It feels like there's a lot of polarisation in the debates that we're having, and there's a lot of polarisation between communities or groups in society. And I wondered, and with the referendum debate and then current issues, we've just seen sort of quite unhinged things on social media or on different platforms that I never would have expected to see before now. I wondered if that polarisation is going to feed into or derail processes for advancing human rights protection, and particularly a Human Rights Act in Australia.
I would agree that there seems to be a lot more polarisation than, say, I remember, certainly 10 years ago or 20 years ago. Unfortunately, I think it might be a fact of life going forward. I don't see how it just disappears, that we're all going to sort of come together and kumbaya. I personally do think it seems to have, you mentioned social media, it seems to have something to do with social media and other sort of dark corners of the internet, 4chan, 8chan, 16chan, I don't know. I mean, I think it's not just social media, but it's the internet generally. I think it's problematic that people, you know, we used to differ over opinions, now we're differing over actual facts. And you can just see that in, you know, the MAGA movement in particular, some of the things that they say or that they seem to believe, and what Donald Trump says every day, you know, in terms of sort of alternative facts. And there's also echo chambers, and I think undoubtedly people have become much less tolerant of other opinions, and particularly opposing opinions. Now, having said that, first of all, you know, social media is not going away. I don't, you know, the genie's out of the bottle. Whether it was good to see people, you know, ever a good idea to see people's thoughts in real time, maybe that wasn't such a good idea, but it's too late. Look, and I also genuinely think, I mean, I enjoy it myself, and I think it does have some very good benefits. I think one being it is an important check on the media itself, because I actually think when it comes to reporting things, the mainstream media is pretty poor in many ways. So, and look, just on social media, just a very quick digression. I am on record as a pretty strong opponent of, you know, having just bagged social media, I'm a very strong opponent of the social media ban for under 16s. I think that's a breach of human rights. I think it could be a breach of the Constitution. And apart from anything else, if it works, I don't know that it will, but if it works, where that means people are not getting social media literacy, and they're getting a lot of, they're not getting social media literacy and a significant amount of internet literacy until they're 16. I think that's terrible. You know, one thing that solves a lot of the problems from social media is actually understanding a little bit about how it works, and that it's not true just simply because, you know, some person has said it. Polarisation is definitely problematic for human rights, because people are shouting at each other, and human rights, you know, sometimes are very clear, but sometimes they clash, and people, you know, have opposing human rights. Apart from anything else, people can have very different views on what human rights are. And I mentioned before, you know, about 25% of Queenslanders in our survey, you know, favouring freedom, whatever they meant by that, over anything else. There are very contradictory views on freedom of speech itself anyway, and we're seeing, I think, sort of quite different views of, this needs protecting, but that should be suppressed, and sometimes, those views seem to be sort of, not very, internally consistent. There are different human rights arguments. I mentioned before the arguments about the exemptions for religious schools in anti-discrimination law. Part of the problem there is differing views on where the actual balance of human rights lies. We're seeing that in arguments, in my view, not as prominent in Australia, but they could be coming, and we'll see in the next panel. But arguments over trans women in sport. And I think there are also a lot of very bad faith arguments out there, and many loud voices and so on. And I come back to the idea that, look, the government has to, it's certainly true they should try and bring people together and not exclude people from the debate, but at some point in time they have to move forward. It's not possible to please everybody, not in such a polarised environment. And I think, at least in its first term, the government tried to do that too much.
Thanks. Hugh?
Yeah, I agree with polarisation is partly driven by social media, which monetises dissent and the loudest voices. We're lucky in Australia to have compulsory voting, because in the US, for example, to get people to turn out to vote, you have to be louder and more aggressive. There's a human rights thinker, Michael Ignatieff, who I've followed a bit of his work, and one thing he did was go around the world and he did these semi-structured interviews with people in all different situations to ask them what they thought about human rights, and he was testing whether the human rights movement had been successful or not, and he, paraphrasing, came to two conclusions. One is it's been incredibly successful in saying that everyone, no matter who they are or where they are, has dignity and deserves respect. And, when I worked at the Europe Justice Commission, I saw the policies of colonial Britain in terms of treating Aboriginal people as less than human, and you look at genocide, the Holocaust, you look at slavery, eugenics. These were all things that human rights has helped to smash as a notion. Of course, there's still problems going on around the world. We've got so much more work to do, but the fundamental underpinning value is that every single person deserves respect and dignity and human rights. Why? Because they're the mere fact that we're all human. And Ignatieff said this is a major success. And even when bad things happen, we're defining it against this standard. But then he said everyone defined their rights as a group in opposition to other groups. And this is the massive challenge that we have. We're socially hardwired to form into groups, and that creates opportunities for people to exploit those divisions. And so the need for us is to find common ground. And I think human beings are naturally empathetic. And how do we find that common ground? And Brian Stevenson, who's a fantastic thinker, talks about proximity. How do you connect with someone who's a completely different life experience, who's involved in the criminal justice system in a watch house in Queensland? How does mainstream Australia understand that experience? How does mainstream Australia understand the experience of First Nations communities who are always proximate to deaths in custody and criminal justice and child removal, something with my upbringing I was so removed from? And I think a lot about, I spoke at a rural and regional conference in Port Macquarie 2 days ago, and I think a lot about the perceived conservatism of rural Australia. And then I think about the Home to Bilo campaign. And you go, here is a family, the Murugappan family, Sri Lankan people seeking asylum, whose asylum claim was rejected, but spent years in this community, raising their children in this community, and the community fought hard for them because they knew them and they had that connection and proximity and that empathy. And suddenly you have this national campaign around that family and the Prime Minister saying, we want them to stay in Australia. And it's an incredible example of what human connection and empathy and finding common ground can do. And I think that's the challenge for us in this increasingly polarised world, is to find those spaces where we can find common ground in humanity. And of course, there are those that know that, who oppose that, who try to put up the walls, the barriers, the media blackouts, the lack of access to journalists and storytellers to stop that from happening.
Thanks. I'm going to ask another question, but then I'm going to take a couple of questions from the audience, so now is the time to start thinking about your question. In another change of direction, you mentioned the Universal Periodic Review, and I mentioned it too. Sarah, you get a chance to mention it too. But these kind of review processes that happen on the international stage, Australia's going to be up in January, I think, for that Universal Periodic Review process. Australia's overdue for the range of treaty monitoring body reviews, so another series of reviews that happen in the UN space. You mentioned a few of the key kind of issues that Australia will probably have to face, but where do you think the international world and the other countries will be looking at Australia closest? And Sarah, I wonder if you can reflect on, do you think it creates domestic pressure to make the government shift further into reform or protection?
Yeah, I think the international system, it's not perfect, but it's the best we've got, and we have to invest in it. And at the moment, that system is absolutely under crisis. I was in Geneva in March, and like the feeling there is palpable because of the retreat from multilateralism, with the funding that's been stripped from the UN system, the funding that's been stripped by the US from the international aid and development system, and then other countries saying we're going to prioritise funding defence spending in Europe over aid and, for the NGO sector and those, more importantly, who benefit from the work in vaccinations and development housing and things like that. It's a disaster. And so a country like Australia has to invest in that system and has to support support multilateralism. Our leadership on that is needed more than ever. These systems, you get what you put into them. So it's about UPR. These recommendations aren't enforceable. There'll be recommendations from countries around the world who don't have good human rights records. You want to pay more attention to the countries that do have human rights records. I was looking at what Canada recommended to us last time. It was essentially set up a Human Rights Act, implement the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People in Australian law, and though France said do better on climate change, these are the kind of recommendations that help to shine a light on the kind of things that Australia should be doing, and the NGOs and others should be focusing on that. And Raise the Age was a big focus last time and helped to elevate that issue in national consciousness.
So to what degree do these kind of processes create pressure domestically for actual reform?
Look, in a way, I think, Hugh, you would know more about that than me in your current role, but also Human Rights Law Centre. I think it's incremental. I mean, as Hugh said, they're not enforceable. Australia does care. It absolutely cares what its peers say to it. It cares about what it thinks, what other countries think about it. So in a way, for Australia and for many countries, UPR, it literally is. My prediction would be that when it comes to Australia's UPR in 2026, that each country that wants to speak will have about a minute. And it's incredible what they'll have to, but it is incredible how many things they can say in a minute. It's actually
5 recommendations or something in 1 minute.
Yeah. Well, no, I've heard more in a minute. So, they dispense with the niceties, and that's actually quite good. So, and so that can sound like a sort of fairly superficial process. And in a way, yes, it is. But all countries care about what other countries say, and everything sort of has, a diplomatic angle to it. The recommendations will undoubtedly be shaped by NGO lobbying, as in Australian NGOs lobbying other embassies as to what they say. I think there's a very strong correlation to NGO lobbying, particularly on the ground in Geneva, close to the time, and what is said by countries to Australia. So Australia cares, but when it comes back to domestic pressure, I think, for a start, is there pressure coming from the Australian people, which is the most obvious source of pressure? It's probably not going to come from the opposition, okay? It could come a bit from the media, particularly The Guardian, which is very good on UN processes, but I don't think the other ones are. And it's quite an esoteric process. And, I'm not sure, I don't blame the Australian people for not knowing a lot about it. So it can help a bit. There will again be, because I don't expect we'll have a Human Rights Act by January or whenever it is, and so there will undoubtedly be lots of recommendations like the one from Canada. It's incremental though. You can't say, oh, it's the game changer, but it helps. It helps. And I know it sounds strange for me to say Australia cares, but maybe not enough to actually do something. But eventually it's sort of, all the various sources of pressure, international, it's probably not the game changer, but it helps. It helps the other sources of pressure. So, and I think, it is important. And strangely enough, like Australia seems to sort of have, in a way, a little bit more respect for UPR. It doesn't walk out of UPR kind of, that was terrible or whatever, whereas Australia, particularly under Liberal governments, has often complained about the other human rights processes, particularly ones from special rapporteurs or the UN treaty bodies. It feels safer attacking those than attacking other countries. I guess that's because of, the possible quid pro quo.
There's a lot more to say about this, but I just make one comment. It provides opportunities for action. And I remember there was an old case, Corinna Horvath, who made a complaint. So she was beaten up by police officers in this bungled raid on her house. She sued the police force and the individual officers in the Victorian Supreme Court, County Court, won. I think she was appealed. She won against the individual police officers, but the state wasn't vicariously liable for their wrongful acts, and in the normal way that an employer would be vicariously liable for the wrongful acts of the employees. And she didn't get justice. So the police officer said, well, we're bankrupt, and they never paid, and it got appealed, and it eventually got taken to the UN and the UN Human Rights Committee. And they made a recommendation that Australia compensate her for this, and it had gone nowhere for like 15 years or something like that, and then Victoria Police compensated her. And I saw Ken Lay, who was the Chief Commissioner at the time, and I said, thank you so much for doing that. Like, what was it that changed your mind? And he said, oh, I'd never seen it before. And I thought it was wrong, and it came across my desk, and I wanted to fix it. And I'm like, like 15 years of work, and then one decision maker, it gets before his desk or her desk, and they say, yes, we're going to fix it. And I'm reminded of a meeting we had with Attorney General George Brandis 2 UPRs ago, and he was in Melbourne. Anna Brown invited him to come to the Human Rights Law Centre offices. We've scrambled to get about 10 NGOs together, some on the phone, some present, to talk about voluntary commitments. And one of the things we said was Australia's got this reservation to CEDAW, the discrimination against women fighting in the army and defence forces. And we said it's wrong. And he said, yeah, that sounds wrong. I'm going to change it. And he did. So we removed that reservation. And it was just those opportunities that presents. And it's hard to get before those decision makers. But what it does, it provides scrutiny, it provides opportunities, it provides pressure. And people in power, it gives them moments to do the right thing.
So I feel like the message is never, 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 never give up, because you don't know at which angle or which intervention or which opportunity or which cocktail party you end up at it's going to actually make a difference.
John Kingdon's policy windows, but on a micro level with decision makers.
Thank you. We've got a chance for some questions. So yes, here in the centre, just wait for the microphone if possible.
Gillian Moon from the Australian Human Rights Institute at UNSW. Thank you very much for your presentation, Hugh, and for the really interesting discussion. And now we all feel overwhelmed by all the work that's ahead of us. But I couldn't help noticing 1 hour into the discussion before there's one mention of climate change, and that's it. And I think that one of the sectors that certainly has the intention and probably the capability to kill a Human Rights Act proposal is Australia's fossil fuel industry. Australia, our contribution totally to annual emissions is about 4.5% of global, and that's enough for our contribution to be worsening climate extremes in Australia and measurably worsening human rights harms in Australia. So that the loop goes straight back. We send it overseas and we harm our human rights. So Hugh, can you tell us what plans the Commission has for addressing these, this part of Australia's activities, particularly in the light of the ICJ decision the other night, which shows that Australia is clearly acting unlawfully. It has not conducted any due diligence. It has no cap, no limit, no plan, no policy, no discussion, no regulatory framework. Those exports don't exist, yet they are causing human rights harm.
Thanks for the question. And so we're about to publish a report on the need for action on climate change, looking at it from a human rights perspective. And I think the Commission hasn't done enough work in this area. And if you go to our website, there's basically next to nothing that we say about climate change, and that's embarrassing, and that has to change. And the team's been doing good work to address that. And so we have a draft report, which I finalised reading last week, which now needs to be updated because of 4 decisions. The Inter-American Court, the Federal Court decision on Torres Strait Islanders, bad decision, the ICJ decision, and I think there was a New South Wales Court of Appeal decision. Yeah. And yeah, that's in there because it's the report. Yeah, so there was the UN Human Rights Committee decision as well. So what role does human rights advocacy have to play in this? I think the environmental movement has been doing a good job, and increasingly human rights advocates are working with the environmental movement to say this isn't just about a healthy planet, it's about the damage to people's lives. So I think we can reach different people in different ways by looking at the different perspectives that human rights advocates bring compared to others, looking at the right to education, the right to housing, the right to jobs, livelihoods that which will be affected by climate change. So we'll be doing more work on that, and it'll come out soon.
I don't have much to say. There is a panel, isn't there, later on? So
to it.
yeah, so we're coming back to it, but in previous UPRs, I don't think climate change has been, or the environment generally. There's been the odd recommendation to Australia about it, but it hasn't been one of the dominant issues. I think it'll be really interesting to see if it's, if it goes way up the charts in the next one, because it probably will, especially with the impetus of these new international decisions.
4 or 6 recommendations last time, and we made sure we had it in there, but we need to elevate it. And it'll be in the UPR advocacy this time.
And look, we've got a moment for a very quick question. Yes, at the back in the maroon top. You'll just have to wait 1 second. And if you can be short. If you can be short. Expansively short.
Hi, I'm Elizabeth from Monash University, and so my quick question is this. Given that you have stated that no one wants to hear from human rights practitioners and legal academics, what is it that we can do to improve this space without generating further polarisation? Thank you.
Sorry, that's. I hope I didn't say that.
But you don't want it to be that sort of News Limited, which is what they absolutely did in 2009, say, oh, this is just a lawyer's picnic. And, taking photos of Human Rights Law Centre dinners and stuff like that as if, as if there was something wrong with having a dinner. So I'll go to you, but you're the one who said it.
I think I said.
Lawyers and academics have a critical role to play, of course, and I'll just give you an example. It's a community development approach. So West Heidelberg Community Legal Centre did some work around repairs to public housing tenancies. How did they do it? They took a real community development approach where they worked with the individual tenants to form a tenancy advocacy group, and then they went to parliamentarians, and who did most of the talking? not the lawyers, but the tenants themselves talking in first-hand language, which is going to make a much greater impact on the decision makers. So that's the kind of work that lawyers and academics need to do to elevate the lived experiences of those people who are affected by human rights abuses and help to give them a platform to talk about the impact on them and what needs to change.
Can I just add one thing to that? And that is, you know, I've sort of been in this game for a long time, and there's always been a feeling, it seems, that, you know, if we do get a codified Human Rights Act, that the easier low-hanging fruit is civil and political rights. And yet people care, and this kind of follows on a bit from the example you just gave, people care so much about economic, social and cultural rights. And so we probably need more messaging in that regard to sort of, you know, indicate to people, look, you know, you have a real stake in this. I mean, they have a stake, of course, in freedom of speech and so on, but, you know, people kind of know about that. They might know a little less about the right to health being a recognised human right.
Well, this is the perfect moment, and thank you, Elizabeth, for that completely unprompted question, which it was. But the perfect moment to sort of wrap up this session. But we've traversed such a great sort of landscape of issues and had these deep dives into specifics of them. I hope this generates a lot of really, really good conversations as we go out to the morning tea. I think you're staying with us for a little bit longer, Hugh, so people can pick on you individually, and Sarah, certainly, people should do that too. But in a very kind and generous and considerate way. So can you join me in thanking our fantastic speakers this morning?